Hey, how's it going? Before we jump into the content, I just want to take a minute to thank you for stopping by the channel and checking out the content. If you like this content and you want to support more content like it, then make sure to subscribe to the channel and like this video. You can also check out the YouTube membership program and cybertrainingpro.com, where I put practice exams and other things that I couldn't put on YouTube. Again, regardless of how you support the channel and my content, I couldn't be more appreciative. Thank you so much, and let's get into the content. IDSs and IPSs are two systems that you're going to hear a lot about in your cybersecurity career. An IDS, or an intrusion detection system, monitors a network, and if it detects any suspicious behavior, then an alert like an email is going to be generated and sent to an administrator. An IPS, or an intrusion prevention system, is very similar to an IDS, except instead of just generating an alert, the system's actually going to stop the attack from occurring. Besides the fact that an IPS is actually going to stop attacks instead of just generating an alert, is the fact that an IPS sits in line with traffic, meaning that everything is going to run through that device. Since an IPS sits in line, we refer to IPS as active, and we refer to an IDS as passive. Let's talk about the two different types of deployment methods that we can use for each type of system. Host-based intrusion detection systems, or HIDs, are a piece of software installed locally on a system, like a server, and they monitor that specific system. HIDs provide another layer of security on that system where it's installed, but again, it's only going to monitor traffic coming into and out of that system's network interface card. We can also have HIPs, which again is just a host-based intrusion prevention system that's going to stop attacks on that system. Network-based intrusion detection systems, or NIDs, monitor activity on a network and not on individual systems. We might use a NIDs on network devices like routers or switches, but a key point is that the traffic can't be encrypted in order to be analyzed. A lot of times on our switches, we're going to enable what's called port mirroring or port spanning, which means the traffic is copied off to another port that has our NIDS analysis system instead of having it plugged directly into ports. Just like with host-based systems, we can also have a NIPS, or a network-based intrusion prevention system. Like a lot of things in security, placement does matter based on what you're trying to accomplish. If you only want to detect activity inside of the network, then you might deploy a sensor on the inside of your firewall so that you don't get overwhelmed by attempted attacks coming in from the internet. When it comes to detection methods, there's two methods of detection that an IDS or an IPS is going to use. We have signature-based detection, and we have heuristic or behavioral detection. Signature-based detection, also known as definition-based, has a database of known vulnerabilities or attack patterns that it compares traffic with. Signature-based detection would be like what your antivirus software uses, and the definitions have to be maintained and updated from the vendor to continue to be effective. Heuristic or behavior-based detection, which is sometimes also called anomaly-based detection, starts by looking at normal network activity, and then it creates a baseline for future comparison. Once activity starts deviating from this baseline, then alerts start getting generated. This type of detection is useful at detecting zero-day exploits because they won't have a signature yet. However, the traffic is still going to deviate from that baseline. You also got to be careful with this detection method if you make changes, because you'll also need to update the baseline, or there's going to be a constant flood of alerts. Just like the rest of our security systems, IDSs and IPSs maintain logs of events that they see. We can also use our SIM tool like Splunk to analyze traffic and identify trends based on what we see. When it comes to IDSs and IPSs, there are four types of responses that can happen. First, we have false positives, which happen when there's no actual attack. Think of this as a false alert. Then we have false negatives, which are when our IDSs or our IPSs fail to send an alert or detect that an attack is in progress. We have true negatives, which is when our systems correctly identify that there's no attack in progress. And then we have true positives, which are when our systems correctly identify that there is an attack in progress. I want you to compare the false positive responses to the children's story of crying wolf. If we receive so many false positive alerts, we're eventually going to ignore the true positive alerts when they finally come through. Likewise, we don't want to let false negative responses to continue either, because that means the attackers are successful. IDSs and IPSs require us to continuously evolve and tune our rule sets so that we only get accurate responses. A common reference that you might be familiar with is to attract bears with honey because it's sweet. With attackers, we use honeypots, which are basically systems or servers that look so vulnerable that they can't be passed up. Now, honeypots are useful for two major reasons. The first reason is that we can divert attackers from our main network. The other reason is that we can analyze attackers' activity. A honeynet is a network of honeypots or vulnerable systems, and it's designed to mimic a live network. Just like with honeypots, we're trying to divert attackers and analyze their activity. A honey file is a file designed to attract an attacker. For example, we might use an attractive name like salaries.txt or passwords.txt, and then we can monitor that file. Wireless networks, also called wireless local area networks or WLANs, are everywhere in companies today. Although they provide a lot of benefit, it can also be easier for an attacker that doesn't need to physically plug into a network port. Let's cover some common terminology before moving on to security. First, wireless access points, which are also called APs, are the devices that connect wireless clients to the wired network. All wireless routers are access points or APs, which basically means that the routers are access points with routing capabilities. On the other hand, not all access points are wireless routers. It's possible to have an access point without that extra functionality. There are two primary radio bands that wireless networks use: 2.4 gigahertz and 5 gigahertz. Each band has several channels to communicate, but typically 2.4 gigahertz travels the furthest and 5 gigahertz transfers the most data. One of the issues with the 2.4 gigahertz band is that channels can overlap and degrade performance. So common practice is to use channels 1, 6, and 11. On the screen here, you can see some common wireless standards and which spectrum that they use. The service set identifier, or the SSID, signifies the wireless network name, which should be something that you configure or change from the default value. One security measure that people tried in the early days was to hide the SSID from broadcasting out to devices, but as attackers have shown, this is a false sense of security, and we can detect this. MAC filtering is when we restrict the MAC addresses from the network interface card that can connect to the network. This is similar to MAC filtering that we can enable on switches. Unfortunately, MAC filtering isn't that effective because an attacker can spoof or change their MAC address to an accepted one, and we call this attack MAC cloning. Site surveys are when we examine a wireless environment for both connectivity and security issues. Wi-Fi analyzers are a tool that we can use to check the level of activity on specific wireless channels in a given area. Heat maps allow us to check the strength of wireless signals and identify dead spots with a color-coded map. Wireless footprinting creates a detailed diagram of access points and hotspots within our organization and can be used together with heat maps to get a full picture. Wireless access point placement is something that we should be concerned with for a few different reasons. Of course, the primary reason dealing with placement is going to be to make sure that we have adequate coverage on all of our sites. The other reason has to do with signal transmission and the type of antennas that we use. Omnidirectional antennas are one option that transmits signals in every direction. Directional antennas transmit the signal only in one direction. Consider if we had attackers in the parking lot of our building and they could simply connect to our wireless network. We need to be concerned with where the signal is transmitted and the strength at which it's transmitted. Don't forget the physical security of access points is extremely important in protecting access. Believe it or not, security was only an afterthought when it comes to wireless. Two wireless cryptographic protocols that were implemented after the fact were Wired Equivalent Privacy, or WEP, and Wi-Fi Protected Access, WEPA. But of course, those were extremely vulnerable to attacks, and we've since moved on to better protections. WEPA 2, also known as the standard 802.11i, is a standard that uses Advanced Encryption Standard, or AES, and Counter Mode CBC MAC Protocol, or CCMP. WEPA 2 is significantly more secure than WEPA ever was. When it comes to WEPA 2, there's 3 different options that it can run and that you need to know about. The first is open, meaning everything is in clear text and it's obviously not secure. We have pre-shared key, or PSK, which requires a passphrase when you try to connect, just like you would have at home. This type of authentication allows users to connect anonymously without a username and password combination. And then we have enterprise, which forces users to authenticate with credentials, like a username and password. With enterprise mode, it uses the 802.1x standard for authentication, which is typically a radius server, to check credentials. Wi-Fi Protected Access 3, or WEPA 3, is the newest Wi-Fi protection standard. It uses something called Simultaneous Authentication of Equals, or SAE, instead of pre-shared keys to secure the authentication. WEPA 3 also supports enterprise mode and the use of radius servers to check credentials. Let's talk about some authentication protocols that you need to know about. The first one is EAP, which allows two systems to create a secure encryption key called a pairwise master key, or a PMK, so that they can then communicate securely. The key that's created is used by AES-based CCMP. We then have protected EAP, or PEEP, which adds a layer of security to EAP by encapsulating and encrypting the EAP conversation in a transport layer security, or a TLS tunnel. The server requires a certificate to use PEEP, but not on the clients, and it's used with the Microsoft Challenge Handshake Authentication Protocol version 2, MS-CHAP v2. EAP Fast, or EAP Flexible Authentication via Secure Tunneling, was designed by Cisco and was a replacement for the lightweight EAP LEAP, which Cisco also designed. EAP Fast supports certificates, but they're optional. EAP TLS, or EAP Transport Layer Security, is one of the most secure standards of EAP. EAP TLS also requires certificates on the 802.1x server and the clients. Just as a reminder, the 802.1x server is the authentication server. EAP TTLS, or EAP Tunneled TLS, is an extension of PEEP and allows systems to use older authentication methods like Password Authentication Protocol, PAP, within a TLS tunnel. EAP TTLS requires a certificate on the 802.1x server, but not on the clients. And then we have Radius Federation, which basically allows users to use single sign-on with 802.1x and Radius servers to access wireless networks. Captive portals are a web page that requires a client to do certain steps before gaining access, like being approved by an employee or running a security check and accepting terms. You might have seen these in businesses like coffee shops or hotels when connecting to Wi-Fi. Just like we have different protection concerns with wireless, we also have different types of attacks that we have to be concerned about. Normal wireless connections happen once a client authenticates with a wireless access point, some data frames get exchanged, and then the connection is formed and the client's now associated with that access point. If an access point receives a disassociation frame from a client, that access point takes the steps to forget about that connection and drop the client. Disassociation attacks are when an attacker sends a disassociation frame to the access point with a spoof MAC address of a victim. Just like normal operation, the access point receives the disassociation frame and disconnects the client. Depending on the situation, this attack could be an annoyance or it could cause serious business issues. As an end user, the only thing that I'm gonna know or see is that my computer keeps dropping the connection. Wi-Fi Protected Setup, or WPS, is a feature that allows users to configure wireless devices without entering a password. Typically, there's a button to press on a device, an option on an internal web page, or an 8-digit PIN number that can be entered to automatically connect the device. WPS is vulnerable to brute force attacks, but currently, if you use it with WEPA 3, it's considered safe. Most security professionals are going to recommend disabling WPS on the access points configuration page. Rogue access points, or rogue APs, are access points that are placed within a network without official authorization. You might also hear these called counterfeit access points. An example would be if an employee brought in a wireless router from home and plugged it in at their desk. We consider this something called shadow IT because essentially these rogue devices aren't going to get the proper attention from IT or security that they should. Another example is if we had an attacker that could plug in a wireless router or access point somewhere in the building to gain access. Ultimately, if you find rogue APs, you need to disconnect them regardless of the controls that you have in place. An evil twin is a rogue access point that uses the same SSID or wireless network name as a legitimate access point. For example, consider if you're at John's coffee shop and we see the normal Wi-Fi name show up, so we connect, except now the attacker can intercept our traffic. An attacker could also set up a login page that every client's directed to for capturing usernames and passwords. Evil twins are something that attackers can pretty easily create using either software or a device called the Wi-Fi Pineapple from Hack5. Site surveys can help us detect evil twins and rogue access points by using wireless scanners and scanning software. Jamming a wireless signal isn't a new idea, and with wireless networks, these attacks interfere with the wireless transmissions and they degrade performance, leading to a denial of service situation. Some access points allow us to increase power levels and even change wireless channels to defeat jamming attacks, although these aren't foolproof methods. Initialization vectors, or IVs, are a number that wireless encryption systems use, so an attack attempts to discover the IV, which can then lead to identifying the pre-shared key, since these systems will combine that key and the IV to encrypt data. One of the reasons this might work is if the encryption system reuses the same IV, it can be easy to determine the key. The WEP wireless encryption method uses small IV numbers, which causes it to be susceptible to IV attacks. As a reminder, WEP has been deprecated and we no longer use it in the real world. Near Field Communication, or NFC, is a group of standards used on mobile devices so that they can communicate with other mobile devices when they're within a certain range of each other. Examples would include features like AirDrop or Tap to Share on your smartphone and the Tap to Pay on credit card readers. Near-field communication attacks are when an attacker uses an NFC reader to capture data from another NFC device. You might have seen examples of these attacks in stories from the news, with experts showing that they can capture credit card information without you even taking out your wallet. Radio frequency identification, or RFID systems, are typically used to track inventory or valuable assets, and they involve RFID tags placed on objects and an RFID reader. There's a few attacks that you need to know about regarding RFID. Sniffing or eavesdropping is possible with RFID because the data is transmitted over the air. However, an attacker needs a system that's tuned to the same frequency and it's capable of interpreting the RFID protocols that are being used. Replay is possible when an attacker can use a bogus tag to mimic the actual tag, allowing theft to take place. And then DOS, or denial of service, is possible when an attacker jams or causes signal interference and effectively disrupts RFID services. Bluetooth is a short-range wireless system that's used in personal area networks, or PANs, which are devices that are close together like smartphones and within other networks. The range for Bluetooth is about 3 meters or 10 feet. There's 3 common attacks that you need to know about for Bluetooth. The first is bluejacking, which is when unsolicited messages are sent to nearby Bluetooth devices. This isn't really that dangerous because it would be text messages or pictures, but it can be an annoyance. Blue snarfing is the unauthorized access to or theft of information from a Bluetooth device. Information stolen can include text messages, pictures, or anything else on the device. And then we have blue bugging, which takes blue snarfing a step further and installs a backdoor on the system. That means an attacker can listen to conversations or pretty much do anything they want on that device. Most Bluetooth attacks these days are rare because software typically is going to require you to manually pair a device instead of broadcasting the device's MAC address during discovery mode, like when Bluetooth was first introduced. Replay attacks in general are when an attacker captures traffic between two systems, modifies it, and then attempts to reuse that communication and impersonate one of the systems. With wireless, replay attacks happen the same way. However, WEPA 2 and WEPA 3 are resistant to replay attacks, so the best defense is to use the latest wireless cryptographic standards. Let's talk about some of the war attacks that are available. The first is war chalking, which isn't really talked about much these days, but in the early days of Wi-Fi, if people found open Wi-Fi networks as they were walking around, they would use sidewalk chalk to draw symbols on the sidewalks. Each of the symbols that somebody would draw would indicate something, like an open wireless network. The second is war driving, and the idea behind war driving is an attacker is looking for a wireless network, specifically using a car to get around. If an attacker picks up a wireless signal, then they can start working on breaking in. And then war flying is the same type of idea, except it uses private planes to intercept signals as high as 2,500 feet in the air. You can even substitute a drone for an airplane, but the idea is the same. Let's talk about some of the remote access security measures that you can take. A virtual private network, or a VPN, is a technology that allows users to access private networks securely via a public network. For example, if we had an employee that was on vacation in Hawaii and wanted to connect back to our internal network shares, then they can connect to a public Wi-Fi network and then connect to our VPN, which allows access to our internal data. All the traffic over the VPN connection is encrypted in a tunnel, so attackers can't sniff that data. There's two ways that we can configure VPNs. The first is through software, and the second is through a dedicated VPN appliance, which we typically call a VPN concentrator. If we use a dedicated VPN appliance, we'll usually put this in a screen subnet like a DMZ so that clients have to connect to that VPN appliance first before access is granted to the internal network. IPsec is a protocol that we can use in VPN tunnels. Now there's two different modes that you need to know about when it comes to IPsec. The first is tunnel mode, which encrypts the entire IP packet. That means that if an attacker captures that packet, they're only going to see the source IP and destination IP of the VPN server, but they're not going to see the internal IP address. The second mode is transport mode, which only encrypts the payload and not the internal IP information. We might use this within our network, but not typically over a public network. IPsec provides security in two ways. First, with authentication, IPsec provides an authentication header, which lets the source and destination host authenticate before they actually exchange data. The authentication header provides both authentication and integrity services using protocol number 51. IPsec also includes an encapsulating security payload, ESP, to encrypt the data and to provide confidentiality. Encapsulating security payload also includes the authentication header so that you get confidentiality, authentication, and integrity using protocol number 50. IPsec uses the Internet Key Exchange (IKE) on port 500 to authenticate clients in the IPsec conversation and create security associations, SAs, to set up a secure communication channel. Some tunneling protocols use transport layer security, TLS, for securing their VPN channels. An example is Secure Sockets Tunneling Protocol, SSTP, and applications like OpenVPN and OpenConnect use TLS for their VPN connections. When talking about VPNs, one of the issues that comes up is should we force all traffic to travel across the VPN tunnel? There's two options that we have. We have split tunnels and full tunnels. With split tunnels, an administrator can decide which traffic should use the encrypted VPN. For example, maybe we don't want a user's general internet search traffic to travel through the VPN and get inspected by all our other security measures. Full tunnels, on the other hand, force all traffic to use an encrypted tunnel when a user is connected to a VPN. A downside of full tunnels is that all that traffic has to get encrypted and decrypted potentially a few times, and speed is definitely going to suffer. Site-to-site VPNs use two VPN servers, one at each site, and then they create a tunnel between each other. One of the most common uses is if we have a headquarters location and we want to connect a remote location with that headquarters location. As far as users are concerned, with site-to-site VPNs, they're transparent and users don't have to do anything special. Always-on VPNs are configured so that whenever a device connects to the internet, the VPN connection is automatically initiated. This removes any manual processes of launching a VPN client. Layer 2 tunneling protocol, LT2P, is a tunneling protocol that's used for VPNs to transport data. L2TP doesn't provide any encryption, so typically we might use IPsec to encrypt data and then transport it using L2TP. HTML5 VPNs are a technology that allows users to connect to a VPN using their web browser. These VPNs use TLS to encrypt their sessions, but it's fairly resource intensive, so you aren't going to see a lot of users that are using it. Let's go ahead and talk about some network access features and technologies that you can use on your network. Network Access Control, or NAC, is a security control that continuously scans systems to make sure that they meet security requirements. If systems fail the inspection, then they can be prevented from connecting to the network or put into an isolated part of the network until the issues are corrected. For example, we might require a certain patching level or to have antivirus software installed prior to connecting to the network. NAC is extremely useful if we allow non-corporate managed devices like a user's home computer to connect to the network. Some of the common health checks that NAC systems perform are checking for firewalls being enabled, making sure that operating systems are current on their patching, and verifying that antivirus software is installed and has current definitions. Again, if any system fails to check, we can have it placed into a remediation or a quarantine network until that issue is resolved. When it comes to NAC systems, they can require permanent agents to be installed, also known as persistent NAC agents, or they can have dissolvable agents that uninstall after they perform the checks or the session ends. When it comes to VPNs, we have to authenticate users and make sure only authorized connections are made. Let's talk about some of the methods that we can use. Password Authentication Protocol, or PAP, is used with the point-to-point protocol, or PTP, to authenticate clients. PPP shouldn't really be used because it sends passwords over the network in clear text. The Challenge Handshake Authentication Protocol, CHAP, uses PPP and authenticates remote users, but it's considered more secure. With CHAP, the client and the server both know a shared secret or a password, but instead of sending the secret in clear text, the client hashes the secret and includes a nonce, or a number used once, provided by the server. Remote Authentication Dial-In Service, or RADIUS, is a centralized authentication service that can validate usernames and passwords for access. RADIUS can also reach out to other servers, like domain controllers, to validate credentials. Some of the key features with RADIUS are that it uses UDP, it only encrypts the password by default, and RADIUS can work with EAP. Terminal Access Controller Access Control Systems Plus, or TACACS Plus, is like RADIUS, except that TACACS Plus encrypts the entire authentication process. TACACS Plus uses multiple challenges and responses between the client and the server, and TACACS Plus was developed by Cisco. Both RADIUS and TACACS Plus are considered AAA protocols, meaning that they provide authentication of users by checking credentials, they authorize users by giving them the correct access, and they provide accounting because they track all the actions that a user takes. These features are crucial when we talk about services that allow access to them and tracking what happens.